there, but we'll stop this.
And Sherry and I had worked with each other on and off throughout the...
Anyway, sorry for that technical difficulty, but we're here with Jacquelyn Malone, who's I'll read a brief introduction. She's been a senior web writer and editor for both IBM and Lotus Development Corporation. She's been a recipient for the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship Grant in Poetry. Her work has appeared in Poetry Magazine, Cimarron Review, Cortland Review, and Poetry Northeast. She has poetry appeared in Poetry Daily. Book All Waters Run to Leith was published by the Finishing Line Press. She has an MFA from Warren Wilson College, where she studied with Thomas Lux and Louise Glock. Very accomplished woman. So I'm glad that you're here on Poet to Poet, Writer to Writer. First off,
nice to be here.
You're the editor for the Mass Poetry. .org, which is the site for the Mass Poetry Festival. So could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I've been doing it actually for about 2 years, and it's reminds me very much of what I did for IBM and Lotus, and that is to make certain that there's a homepage story that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And mainly what I do is that, you know, beginning in a couple of months, we'll have a lot of stories about the Mass Poetry Festival and about the Student Day of Poetry, as well as Common Threads, which we also produce.
Mm-hmm.
But in the summer, it's a kind of quiet time, so I have to come up with an idea of what will be interesting. So this last summer, I had a series called The State of Poetry.
Okay.
And
you invited me, which was
that's right.
Yeah.
And thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was really interesting.
Yeah.
And what I found really interesting about everybody who wrote, and there were 14 people all together.
Why don't you sit over here, because I think you should be more centered when the sun
Okay.
in all your glory. Go
All
ahead.
right.
Yeah.
The State of Poetry, as I said, there were 14 people.
Yeah, right.
And everybody had a different sense of what the state of poetry was. When I hear that phrase, I wrote for a long period of time, and then because of family issues, I quit writing for about 10 to 15 years.
Okay.
And when I came back, poetry had changed radically.
Okay.
And to me, that was how it changed. What it was like before and what it was like afterward is kind of what I think of as the state of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
But other people had totally different. Like one person wrote about the state of poetry, what's happening in Western Mass,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of
there's a revival there with the presses like the independent presses, like the small press, the small beer press, and other things like that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And also a lot of reading series.
Okay.
So, but you know, as I said, everybody had a kind of different take on it, which I think worked out really well.
Okay.
And those stories, by the way, are still on masspoetry.org. And if you look in the right column, you'll see a statement that says State of Poetry Essays, and they're all listed there.
Great. That's great. Now, and who have you had in those State of Poetry? Name some of the
Well,
people.
they started off with Richard Hoffman.
Know him well? Yeah.
And Jennifer Jean.
Yes.
January O'Neill.
Right. What is she, like the assistant director or something of the Mass Poetry?
She's the executive director.
Executive
of
director.
Mass Poetry.
Right.
I'm drawing a blank right now.
Right now, one fellow. Now I'm trying. Yeah. Well, anyway.
Yeah, and you.
And me. Yeah. Right. Well, I was very honored. Charles Coe.
Yes, Charles Coe.
We
Right.
just had at Endicott College.
Right.
All right. I noticed you studied with Louise Glock,
Right.
who is the former poet laureate. Her poetry, at least what I've read, seems to be a bit stark and very dark. How was she as a teacher?
She was very good. I had her my last semester at Warren Wilson. And immediately before, I had Stephen Dobbins. I mean, you work at these places, you work with the person that individually. It's like Louise had 6 people, Stephen had 6 people, before him Thomas Lux had 6 people. And you write a contract about what you're going to do during the semester. And it's funny, I had Stephen one semester and then Louise the next, and they both had diametrically different points of view about what would be a good poem. And for example, Stephen would say, how did you get from here to here? You need to kind of let the reader know how you got from here to here. And Louise would say, take out that. You don't need that, you know. Poetry can leap, you know. So it was great. It's like one whispering in one ear and one in the other when I write.
Well, yeah, there's always, there's always two views of what poetry should be and how and like I always tell people, one person could say yours is the best thing since chopped liver, and the other could say it's horrible. I mean, it's a very subjective thing. I was just reading in the New York Times yesterday about the famous poet. Did you read the New York Times art section yesterday? It's about the one on Cape Cod. She writes about nature.
Yes, Mary Morris.
Mary Oliver.
Oliver.
Right. And between both of us, we'll get something right. I mean, Mary Oliver, and a lot of people come down on her because some people feel she's simplistic, and it's not an elegant style. It's very down to earth about nature, et cetera, et cetera. And other people think and these are prominent people on either side of the coin. Yeah. She's just came out with a book about her dogs now. I think I was reading about that.
Yes.
Your current project is a historical verse novel. James and Lottie. It's called it's titled
James and Lottie. Yes.
Right, James and Lottie, and is known they're known as the mother of Nashville.
Mother and father of Nashville, because they were the people who led the first wave of settlers from the mountains in North Carolina to the Cumberland River, which is about 250 miles if you went overland. The women went by the river route, which was 1,000 miles and was supposed to be easy, but they didn't realize that there were whirlpools and rapids and things called the boiling pot and Indian attacks and smallpox and a woman who delivered a baby one day and the next day the Indians attacked. And she got out to push the boat over the sandbar it was stuck on, and the baby went overboard. So it's just horrible. And it was the coldest winter in Tennessee history.
Okay. And why did you choose this, of all places? Are you from Tennessee? Or?
I am from Tennessee.
Okay.
I chose it because as a kid, I would hear vaguely these stories.
Right.
And I never really paid attention to it until all the people that I could have asked about it were dead. And then I happened to be in Nashville at the State Archives, and I read this journal that was written in the process of going down the river, and by the man who led it, whose name was John Donaldson, who, by the way, was the father of Rachel Donaldson, who married Andrew Jackson.
Oh, okay.
He was a very literate man, and it's very brief and to the point. It just raises the hair on your head to read some of the things they went through.
Hard to make one. You understand. But you're also, you say you're interested in the cultural, how cultural difference sparks misunderstanding and brutality. And what did you find in this historical verse? I'm going to attempt this again. We'll see if it works.
Okay.
But go ahead. Just speak.
All right. Well, when I first became interested in it, I was interested primarily in the women and what it must have been to have been a mother with 2 or 3 small children, to go into this world where at that point you couldn't bring a wagon. So you had to bring everything by horseback, and there was very little there. So I was really interested in that. But the more I read about it, the more I became fascinated by the interaction between particularly James Robertson and the Indian chief Atakulakula, who was the Cherokee chief. And though I don't get into Atakulakula's background, he was a fascinating man because as a small boy, he had been taken to England with a group of 6 other Indians to be introduced to the king. So the king would have some sense of the people that had originally lived in America. And he stayed there for several months and became he learned English, he became somewhat in love with England. And he and James Robertson got along beautifully. But that did not mean that it's going to turn out right.
Okay. And there was a lot of...
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about Atakulakula's son, he realized if the whites came over the mountain, it was the end of the Indian way of life.
And again, because we were cut off, just for the sake of the tape, you're discussing now is Lottie
and James.
And Lottie and James, which is we are working on now. It's in progress, and it's historical verse.
Right.
What are the particular challenges, shall we say, of trying to write a historical novel in verse? I mean, it's hard enough writing a historical novel. You choose to write it in verse. Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things that I first of all read a lot of novels in verse. My favorite is one called Home Movies by the English writer Craig Rain. And he's married to a Pasternak. And his book, Home Movie, is about the Pasternaks in Russia in World War I and the Rain family in England in World War I. And you get a sense of Pasternak's brothers and Pasternak himself, and then the Rain family too, their personalities and things. So, it just sounded really interesting. Anne Carson has written the autobiography of Red. I also, one of my favorite...
Ed Sanders wrote a novel, wasn't a novel, it was a memoir in verse.
Really?
1968 about the convention in Chicago.
Oh.
Ed Sanders of the Fugs?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. It was, yeah.
Oh, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. Called 1968, yeah.
1968.
Yep.
One of the interesting things about
Memoir, yeah.
yeah,
And verse and all that. Yeah.
verse is...
Well, we're talking about the difficulties of
the difficulties. Yeah, it's kind of trying to have something that leads people through, but that doesn't become monotonous. I wanted to do a variety of types. For example, there's a poem that almost begins the thing about what some say is the first skirmish of the Revolutionary War. It appeared 3 years before the Tea Party. And that's...
Don't get those confused, though, right?
Oh, yeah. But the story, that's a straight kind of almost narrative about, going in and grabbing this white-wigged judge and dragging him out. And then a lot of it is dramatic monologue.
But going way back, I mean, novels were written in verse, right?
That's right.
I mean, so this isn't a new...
Yeah, right. And I know what I was going to say earlier is that one of the other writers I absolutely love wrote he wrote not translations, recreations of the Iliad.
Mhm.
And they are absolutely wonderful. Christopher Logue, who died, I guess, about 3 years ago, but he wrote these really wonderful contemporary things. It's like he talks about somebody shooting an arrow and it goes through someone's neck, creating a hole the size of a lipstick case.
Oh, wow.
And it's filled with this dialogue that is just wonderful between characters. And anyway, that made a big impression on me.
Okay. You have a book out about your father's Alzheimer's playbill for the Great One, and in a way, you in your other book you're trying to restore the historical memory, and in your in your verse novel, and I guess you're sort of moaning the loss of your father's memory in this book. I mean, do you think that's the poet's role to sort of recapture time and memory? And maybe I'm stretching it. I don't know, but
I think it can be.
Yeah.
I mean,
to be able to capture that moment, to get that slice of history.
capture that moment, and also to kind of describe what Alzheimer's is. I mean, people just think it's the loss of memory, but
I just hope between us we're not exhibiting early signs.
Right, forgetting what was
Yeah,
happening.
yeah,
Oh, God.
yeah, God. All right, but anyway.
Yeah, but you know, there are so many other elements
Yeah.
of Alzheimer's, like personality changes, radical.
Depression and anger.
Depression, anger, you know. My father was this...
How old was he when he developed it?
Well, it's hard to say, you know, because it comes on gradually. And he was doing strange things that my mother would say, you know, like putting the mail in the refrigerator.
Yeah.
But...
Well, unless you know, especially if you're into hot mail. Yeah, that is strange. Yeah, oh, God. Bad joke. But anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So, my brother and I, you know, my parents were still in Nashville, and my brother was in Vermont, and I was here, and you know, we kind of thought Mom was exaggerating, and then one day he came up, you know, my parents came up to visit, and we were playing Scrabble, and he put down the word puppet, but instead of starting with the P, he started with the T, and my daughter laughed, and he picked up the table and threw it in the air like that, because it was a card table, just absolutely furious. And he had always been this quiet, kind of gentle man.
Did he say what he was annoyed about? Or just...
Well, it was, I don't think we really talked about it because it was so
yeah.
startling.
Yeah.
You know, you just, and my mom was really upset with him, and you know, he calmed down, and he felt embarrassed, I think. But, you know, again, then Mom started talking about the fact that he tried to kill her in a fit of anger. So.
And that wasn't like him at all?
No, no.
Wow.
That, and he still retains certain things. In fact, one of the poems that is in my book is, he was always a storyteller. And he would tell stories, even that didn't make any sense at all at some point. But he would tell them.
He still has the cadences and things like that.
Yes,
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right.
So sort of like, you know, he's sort of, you know, there are remnants of him, but there's not, you know, there's sort of like shadows.
Right. And by the time he died, he didn't know anyone.
And it's interesting the way you frame this. You use the conceit of your father on the stage, and in fact, in Who's There, it seems you use a scene out of Hamlet, right? And it seems he's sort of in Hamlet's existential crisis of being, but even more so removed, right?
Right.
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 Talk a bit about that.
Right. Actually, I have him, and there are 8 segments to this poem, and each segment he's playing a different character. And this particular one, he's playing Hamlet's father. But, you know, he is a puppet also. That's one of the givens. But he goes on stage at that very first, where the guard said, "Who's there?" And, you know, the poem ends with he doesn't know. He can't say whether it's king or player or fool or a man.
Very poignant. You know, you have about 8 minutes, so I want you to read some of your work from both your historical verse novel, Lottie and
James.
And from Playbill.
Okay. All right.
And where can these be ordered? I mean, a historical novel can't be ordered yet. It's not
Right.
done yet. But where can that be? On Amazon, obviously.
Amazon and
Finishing Line.
Finishing Line.
Linepress.com, I believe it is. Okay.
Finishingline.com. I'm going to read first a portion from Lottie and James. And it starts with why Lottie and James wanted to move west. And in the first section, it starts with the Hillsborough riot, which some say is the first skirmish of the Revolutionary War, 3 years before the Tea Party. The Hillsborough riot, September 22nd, 1770. Amassing in wagon rut roads that divide fields from forest, farmers, a hand's width apart, are thwarted bees. Their whips and clubs clinging like pollen to their thighs. They're out for sheriffs that steal their taxes, out for lawyers that rig their trials, out for the royal governor who builds a mansion on the frontier edge of their last cent. Into the courtroom they swarm as timid toadies cower in cloakrooms and under desk. They surge up to the judge where the white-wigged scamp raises his startled eyes above a blitz of crude boots. They pluck him by his arms and drag him, head thumping down the stone steps into the streets where whips sting welts across his back. You dirt-daubing bloodsucker. The whip comes down and a splash of red. They will not be assuaged, for this is warfare of injustice, warfare of class. The second poem in this section is spoken by the only character in the book that is totally made up, and that's the god of history. I felt a need for something that shows how unfair history is, how things just don't work out the way they sometimes should. And this god is a little bit like Puck, who sits up and says, "What fools these mortals be." And Bonabane, which is his name, often takes the shape of a hawk. And his name, Bonabane, means the killer of good. Bonabane, the all-seer, takes note. Shree, shree. Look at that wigged head go popping down the stone steps. Pop, 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 sree, pop. There's the action, and sree, there'll be a reaction. I'll write, I'll indict that script. Little noggin throbbing down those steps. Your flogging is the start of something big. Your fine linen against their homespun. You're born with against their sweat earned. That little spark will hit a dry leaf. A dry leaf, a dry limb. A dry limb hits a tree and a tree and a tree and a tree. Shree, shree. Get out of my way, I'm diving. Get out of my way, I'm gyring. On a thermal swinging high, sweeping low. I'll write it, I'll indict it. A cockfight. Ha ha! A plethora of cockfights. And I got the best seat in the house. Sree, sree, oh. The next section is where you meet James. James was a very young man, and he went with Daniel Boone to some of the exploring. And he's been sent out by the North Carolina men to look for a place to get away from the British. The person mentioned in this, Attakulla is the Cherokee chief. James in the wilderness. James stumbles into a mountain clearing, the top of a head to Bonabane, hovering above the thermals. First fledgling, the creature squeaks like a hawk. Soon the flock, sree, sree, soon a flock of cocks. Up into the spiraled wind, Bonabane shoots, high enough to see the Atlantic's arriving wooden ships, the British fort some way in, Cherokee villages to the southeast, the Shawnee Nation sprinkled thin across a broad swath. He sees the French trappers along the Land-Splitter River to the west, that deep river, mouth to the sea, and the Spanish forts along the long-hanging Sausage to the south. So many cocks, Bonabane shrieks, with so many sharp-clawed dreams, so easy to provoke, so many cocks with bladed spurs. He wheels back to the man and chortles like a wild turkey. Come, fog, come, mine meddling fog, fill this reckonless wilderness and fix him in the fog. It will not lift for days. James struggles on in the old fields, cloaked in a cowl of mist. No food, powder horn gone soggy, no horse no use in the vertical mountain scarps, where trees grow in the nooks of rock precipices, no compass, moss on all sides of trees. James, the colonial scout sent out beyond the readouts of British muskets and colonial anger, is looking for a peaceful land, trespassing into Attakulla's hunting ground, thinking he's north of Attakulla's hunting ground, knowing nowhere else to go. James slogs down a steep slope, trudging through decades of leaf fall, fluid as mud, until under the murk an old log cracks. Instantly he's down, crouched in rhododendron, stick or arrow poking through the bush. The woodpecker hacks dogwood, fog dips from the oak's multicolored leaves, the blue jay hectors the grackle,